Lesson 17, Breathing Marks. So, Catherine, we've looked at lots of Greek letters so far that make sounds that correspond to English letters. But we don't have in Greek a letter that corresponds to our English or Roman letter H. There's no Greek H, in other words. There's no letter that makes a sound.
Exactly. We have to use particular marks above vowels in particular. And those marks are called breathing marks because they control whether we pronounce h, the breath, or whether we don't. And so they're called breathing marks, and they're the closest thing we have to any sort of H representation in Greek.
And it's important to note that these breathing marks can only sit above a vowel, plus one other special consonant that we'll talk about later. And these breathing marks can be a little confusing for beginners because you have to look carefully at which direction they're pointing.
Right, which is why you made the font bigger so that it's easier to see.
Exactly. And so we have two kinds of breathing marks. We have one breathing mark that's called a smooth breathing, and another one called a rough breathing. And these little marks, called breathing marks, or just breathings, we could call them, they sit above a vowel. And these small markings look like an apostrophe, perhaps, or a tiny letter C. And here's the basic idea, is that the smooth breathing doesn't do anything. That's the one that points to the left. If you look at the apostrophe marking, which is actually the breathing mark, the one where the bottom points to the left, that is called the smooth breathing. But the backward apostrophe, where the bottom of the apostrophe points to the right, that's called a rough breathing.
The way that I remembered this when I was learning Greek for the first time was that the direction of the breathing mark indicated whether the air was going to come out as a h or not. So if the breathing mark was pointing to the left, i.e. towards the beginning of the word, then the breath just stays unpronounced because it's not being breathed out. But if it's a rough breathing and it's pointing to the right, i.e. into the word, then the breathing goes out and is pronounced, and so ha.
That's a good mnemonic for remembering the different breathings. So you'll see these breathing marks at the beginning of a word. And if the word starts with a vowel that has a smooth breathing, nothing happens. You just pronounce the vowel the way you would always pronounce it. It's basically a silent marking. But if the word starts with a vowel and that vowel has a rough breathing, in other words, the backward apostrophe, or the one with the bottom pointing to the right, that's a rough breathing, and you're going to pronounce that word as if it starts with the letter H. So you'll have a h sound at the beginning of that vowel sound. And so to demonstrate, I've got the same exact word, epsilon, lambda, mu. I've got that word spelled out twice, once with a smooth breathing over the epsilon and once with a rough breathing over the epsilon. So, Catherine, why don't you take us through those two words and tell us how each will differ in its sound?
Sure. The first word has an epsilon at the beginning and a breathing mark that looks like an apostrophe. So it's pointing to the left, which means that it's a smooth breathing, and therefore we're just going to pronounce the word as if there were no breathing mark at all. So elm. But the second word, the epsilon at the beginning, has a rough breathing, that backwards apostrophe looking one that points to the right. And so that breath is going to come out and be pronounced. And so it's going to be helm.
So we have elm and helm, two English words that we're just using for practice. They're spelled with the exact same three Greek letters. The only difference is one has a smooth breathing and one has a rough breathing. So the one with the smooth breathing sounds like elm. The one with the rough breathing, well, that provides the H sound. And so the one with the rough breathing sounds like helm.
One of the things about breathing marks is they can seem like a very insignificant detail at first. But what our listeners will find as they move forward after they finish this book and as they move to learn more and more Greek vocabulary, some words, the only difference between them in terms of spelling is whether they have a rough or smooth breathing. But they're completely different words with completely different meanings. So it really does pay off to pay attention to the breathing marks from the beginning so that our listeners get used to noticing whether it's a rough breathing ha or a smooth breathing that's not pronounced at all.
These small markings in Greek can make a huge difference. So you really have to read the fine print, so to speak, and pay attention to these tiny details. I guess you could say you have to read Greek in a detail-oriented kind of way. You can't just sort of gloss over things. You can't just go on autopilot and just not pay attention to some of these important markings.
Exactly.
And I've concocted some special reading exercises for you in this lesson to help you get accustomed to the difference between the rough breathing and the smooth breathing. So in number 1, the breathing is pointing to the right. Notice the bottom of the apostrophe-like character points to the right. So that's a rough breathing. So that gives us an H sound at the beginning of this word. Along with the letter omega, it'll give us hotel. So number 1 is hotel with a rough breathing. Number 2 has a smooth breathing. Notice that the bottom of the breathing is pointing to the left. It just looks like a regular apostrophe that you might see in English. So the sound of that first letter, the epsilon, will not be affected. So we just have a regular epsilon sound at the beginning, and that word sounds like elbow. Again, that smooth breathing is just silent. It doesn't do anything. Same thing for number 3. We have oaks, like if you have some oak trees. Again, we have a smooth breathing, so the sound of the omega is not affected. But in number 4, we have that same exact word, omega, kappa, sigma, but now with a rough breathing. Notice that that particular breathing mark points to the right. That gives us an H sound, and so that word sounds like hoax. So number 3 is oaks. Number 4 is hoax. Okay, so these exercises are engineered in such a way to help you practice the breathing marks. In number 5, we have host. In number 6, we have home. Number 7, elm. Number 8, helm. Those are the same ones from our lesson this time. Number 9, hope. Number 10, head. And then we have some repeated exercises from before.